blacks in jury selection process was uncovered. Judge Namm believed he was witnessing the systematic corruption of the county's criminal justice system. After 2 public hearings, the commission assigned to investigate the corruption proved that the corruption and systematic corruption existed in the district attorney's office. He was transferred out of the county court system to the civil court, part of the Supreme Court, and Judge Namm handed down to Scott Carroll, a notorious serial rapist, the longest sentence ever handed out in New York State, 375 to 750 years in prison. He deserved it. In 1992, Judge Namm retired to the beautiful state of North Carolina. Way to go. Finally, Judge Namm, in 1993, received 3 prestigious awards from New York. The Thurgood Marshall Award from the New York State Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, in which he was the second recipient of this award. Supreme Court Judge Marshall was the first. He also received the David S. Michael Award from the New York Bar Association, and finally the NAACP Award of Suffolk County. In closing, I'd like to say, Judge Namm, I'd like to leave you a quote from our 26th President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. The only man who makes no mistake is a man who does nothing. And you definitely did something because you made some changes, sir. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce you, the Honorable Judge Stuart Namm.
Well, I might as well sit down because I think Gerald told you everything I was about to say. This is the second time that I've had an opportunity to speak in Wilmington. The first time was about probably 10 years ago now, at the first Martin Luther King breakfast of the NAACP in New Hanover County. And that was a great experience, and I spoke mostly about Martin Luther King because he was one of my idols in life. But I thought that even though this is a luncheon which is honoring Martin Luther King, and it's in Black History Month, I thought you might want to hear my story because I think it's an incredible story. It's hard to say that when you're talking about yourself, but it's a story that people have to hear and have to know, and it's about injustice. As you heard, I grew up in Brooklyn, and I was born during the Great Depression, and I lived in the tenements of Brooklyn. And so I was not a rich kid, I was a poor kid. My father and my family was on home relief, that's what we called it in those days. I was lucky enough to get into Brooklyn Technical High School, which you had to take an exam to get in. And at that time, when I graduated from high school, believe it or not, colleges in this country were free tuition. City College of New York, which is today's City University of New York, and one of the greatest universities in the world, and which has had more Nobel Prize winners and Pulitzer Prize winners than any other university in the world, was free. Not 1 penny to get into that school, but for a $15 registration fee. But for that fact, I would not be standing in front of you today. It was during the Korean War that I entered City College, and so I decided, not realizing that lieutenants get killed more than privates, I said, if I'm going to go to Korea, I want to be an officer. So I enlisted in the ROTC. And by the way, at that very same ROTC in my 4th year was General Colin Powell, because he was from City College of New York. When I graduated from City College, I went to Korea, and I was an infantry lieutenant. First I went to Ranger School, and then I was an infantry lieutenant, and I was assigned to handle 2 courts-martial. For a general court, you have to have a lawyer representing a soldier, but for a special court, an officer gets assigned that. And I was assigned, I think, 3 trials. Well, 2 of the men were acquitted. And the colonel called me into his office, and he said to me, Lieutenant, don't you know these guys are guilty before they go to trial? And I said, sir, but your panel found them not guilty. He said, okay, from now on, you're going to be my courts and boards officer. So for over a year, I was no longer a platoon leader, I was a courts and boards officer. During my time in Korea, I decided I wanted to go to law school. I knew I wanted to go to law school. My first wife was passed, applied for me to Brooklyn Law School. I couldn't afford to go during the day, So I went to evening Brooklyn Law School. At the end of 4 years, I got out of law school. In my last year of law school, John F. Kennedy was president. And that quote was up there just a few moments ago. I heard his inaugural speech, and when he said, ask not what you can do for your country, but ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, I thought about that, and I decided I wanted to go into government. And actually, in those days, he had a law honor graduate program. And they actually came to the law schools and recruited people, and I was recruited to go to the work for the Federal Trade Commission. And I worked for the Federal Trade Commission for 5 years. Now, I have to tell you, when I was in City College, I was first an engineering student, and then I was a liberal arts student, and I really wanted to be a judge. Now, to be honest with you, most people don't dream about being judges. I wanted to be a judge. My first wife and I, we both lived in Brooklyn, we had no money. A date on a Saturday night would be, for a nickel, take the subway to Manhattan, to 100 Center Street, which was Magistrate's Court. And we would sit there on a Saturday night, watching drunks being brought in before the judge and arraigned. And to me, that was the concept of what I thought court was about. And so I really wanted to be a judge. By the way, for an additional nickel, we would take the South Ferry to Staten Island, stay on the ferry, and it would only cost you with the 1 nickel, and then just take the subway back to Brooklyn. And that was a Saturday night date, and I would actually have a notebook taking notes. So this was my dream. When I was in the Federal Trade Commission, we had moved to Long Island, out in Suffolk County, which is now buried under snow. And it was too far to travel to downtown Manhattan because our office was in the United States Courthouse. But something happened in that United States Courthouse. I was sharing an office with a black attorney who had worked in the NAACP in Washington. And Lyndon Johnson appointed Thurgood Marshall to the bench while I was in the building. And my office mate said to me, do you want to meet Thurgood? Of course, I knew everything about Thurgood Marshall. I had taken state and local government at City College, and in fact, my professor at City College had written the historical brief for Brown against Board of Education. I said, who would not want to meet Thurgood Marshall? And so he called down to the office, and we went to Thurgood Marshall's chambers, and this huge man, and he was a huge man, and I'm a little guy, and he looked down at me, and he put the big hands out, and I never forgot that moment. It was one of the greatest moments of my life. Well, anyway, being out in Long Island and having this long trip into New York to Lower Manhattan, which was 2.5 hours each way, I decided I had to do something else. So I decided to try to get into a law office locally. And I met a young lawyer who had just opened an office, who's now, by the way, a federal judge in Brooklyn. And he hired me, and he just wrote a book, actually. He called me his worker bee. I didn't think I was that, but that's what he calls me. And he said to me when he hired me that he was going to form a partnership with a man who was going to become, or was already, the Democratic leader of Brookhaven, of Suffolk County. And no, at that time it was Brookhaven Town, where I lived. And he said, would you mind that? I said, no, why would I mind it? I'm going to work for you. Well, for a year I worked for these guys. The political leader was a politician, so he really never went to court. My other boss was brilliant, writing appeals and things, and I was basically the guy who was going to court. Now, I always wanted to be a judge. I'm in the same office as a political leader, and one day I'd say to him, or several times I might say to him, Dominic, I really want to be a judge someday. And you just forget about it. Well, one day I get a telephone call, and it wasn't from him, it was from this committee that was selecting candidates for district court, which is the lowest court in Long Island. And they asked me if I would run for judge. Now, I knew in my town there was no way in hell that I could get elected judge because I was a Democrat in a Republican town. But you know what happened? Watergate. Watergate was just happening just before I was nominated. And I ended up winning an election by 72 votes out of 58,000 votes casted. And there was constant recounts because I defeated an incumbent judge. And every time there was a recount by a Republican judge, I'd lose votes. But by December 31st of that year, because I didn't know whether I was going to be a judge or a lawyer come January 2nd, on December 31st, he relented and decided not to take any more appeals, and I became a judge. And for 6 years, I was a district court judge, which again is a lower court. The only criminal cases you handle basically are arraignments or pre-trial examinations. And I got a reputation. I was pretty tough. When I was running, people would say to me, because I really went out in the streets to run, because I knew I was going to lose, but I tried anyway. People would say, what do you think about the revolving door of justice? And I'd say to them, well, I don't like that, and if I'm a judge, I'll do what you'd like me to do as a judge. And one person would say to me, well, what would you do if you had to sentence somebody to death? Well, we didn't have the death penalty in New York State. We had 2 Catholic governors, both of whom who had vetoed the death penalty in New York State. But I said, if the jury recommended death and I thought the man was guilty, or woman, I would go along with it. So I was a relatively tough judge. In fact, I was so well liked by the police that when I was running, I tried to run for family court in the middle of my term, the police association endorsed me. Well, come the end of 6 years, Ronald Reagan was now president, and the town of Brookhaven went back to its roots. And I could have run against Mickey Mouse, and I wouldn't defeat him. And I lost. And I went back to my former partner, who was now the county chairman, and I said to him, Dominic, I'd like to get back on the bench. And he said to me, this is the answer from a man I practiced law with for 10 years. He said, you damn judges, you're no good. You used to help the party, but you don't do anything for the party now. And I got a whole long line of people who want to be judges, and I'm pretty much quoting him verbatim. And so I walked away. But what happened was Dominic had a heart attack, and his second in command of the Suffolk County Democratic Party recommended me. There was an opening in the higher court, in the county court of Suffolk County, which is the felony court in New York State. And he recommended me to Governor Hugh Carey, and I went before a committee of lawyers in Albany, and I was found well qualified, and I was appointed by Governor Carey to the higher court. And but I was going to have to run again in November. And Suffolk County was a Republican county, and I knew I'm in this court, but I'm going to be here for 9 months, and that's going to be it. But as luck would have it, that summer, excuse me, I'm a little old and my voice gets a little raspy. That summer, the New York State Legislature decided to create new judgeships in the state. And in order to do that, we had 2 houses, as you have in North Carolina. We had the Assembly and the Senate. The Assembly was Democratic, the Senate was Republican. And they weren't going to create these judgeships unless they knew that their candidates were going to get elected. So they had what they called a cross-endorsement deal, which meant that whoever was nominated by that particular party would get endorsed by the other party. And so, as luck would have it, I was nominated, and I was in the court, and I was a county court judge now for 10 years. Well, I was still tough when I was in the county court. I have to tell you this, only after about 1 year, and the administrative judge knew about me from the lower court, he asked me if I would be willing to handle homicides. Now, I had never tried a homicide case as a lawyer. Usually homicide cases are either tried by legal aid lawyers, or the defendant is very wealthy and they hire very good lawyers. And I wasn't one of those kind of lawyers. But I said, yes, I would love to do it. And I have to say that in the first couple of years of handling homicides, and there were 3 of us handling homicides, we had about 60 homicides a year in Suffolk County. I had never done this before, and I would see the same people testify because we had a homicide squad, and they were the guys who were investigating homicides. And I pretty much went along with them and believed virtually everything they said. Then there came a day when I had a case, a young black man was being tried for attempted murder, and he needed a lawyer. And as a county court judge, we would assign lawyers. Legal aid was not allowed to handle a Class A felony or even a Class B felony, which this was. And so he was charged with attempted murder. And I had a friend who sat next to me at Brooklyn Law School at night. His name was Pete Newman, and he was a black man. We were good friends. And he was a lawyer in Suffolk County. And I appointed Pete Newman to represent this young black man who was only, at that time, I think, 19 years old. And as soon as Pete Newman came in, he challenged the jury panel in Suffolk County. He said that, in his opinion, Suffolk County was not bringing young black people into the jury. And so we had a hearing on that. We conducted a hearing. And 3 district attorneys, assistant district attorneys, the chief of the bureau and 2 others, all testified consistently with each other that 1 out of every 3 juries has a young black person in it. Now, I had tried by that time 7 or 8 homicides. I had never seen, I saw black people, never saw a young black person. And I went back and scratched my head. How could it, and that, by the way, 1 out of 3 was consistent with the percentage of young blacks in the county. And the hearing went on, and the commission of jurors was brought in. And I went into his records and I found out that he was only soliciting, because at that time you could be on a jury from 18 years of age, only soliciting graduates of white high schools in Suffolk County, but never sent solicitations out to places like Wyandanch and some of the other communities which were predominantly African American. So I held that there was discrimination. However, the Supreme Court of the United States had ruled in previous decision that that is not a recognizable group. Blacks are recognized, African Americans are a recognizable group, but young African Americans are not a recognizable group, therefore I couldn't set aside the charge or say that Suffolk, or move the case to another jurisdiction. In any event, I call that my eye-opener, because I went home and I realized 3 DAs had just lied to me. The top DA in the district attorney's office, other than the district attorney himself, and 2 of the top trial lawyers. Well, almost immediately after that, I had 2 major homicide cases, and they were bad. One was a murder of a nurse who had just come home from work. She was raped and murdered in the basement of her home. And the other was basically a mob hit by a guy who had been in the mob in New York City. I heard some of this testimony in this case, and they would bring in what we call jailhouse snitches. A jailhouse snitch is somebody that says that the defendant told me he committed this particular murder. And you know, when you're there long enough, you know what a jailhouse snitch is. And of course, they'll say they made no deal, but there's always promises been made to him. They're never on the record. And so I began to see things that I didn't like it at all. And now I was no longer a greenhorn who didn't know anything about the law. And so I went home one day. My first wife was a probation officer. She was in the family court because she couldn't work. She went back to college after our children grew up. And she wasn't permitted to work in the criminal division, but she could work in the family court. And I went home to her and I said, Lenore, and by the way, I was saying things on the record in the courtroom. I mean, and I was holding hearings, and I was really questioning everything that was going on. And I went home one day and I said to her, Lenore, I can't do this anymore. I said, I'm going to write to Governor Cuomo, who was then the governor of New York State. I said, I'm going to ask for an investigation of the Homicide Squad and the district attorney's office. Because, by the way, both of those 2 defendants who were guilty, unquestionably guilty, were both acquitted by the juries because they could not believe the testimony of the police officers and the jailhouse snitches. And I said, Lenore, our lives will never be the same once I do this. And she said to me, Stuart, you do whatever you have to do. And so I wrote to Governor Cuomo, and we went away on vacation. We went to South America that year, just before there was an election coming up. And when I wrote to Governor Cuomo, I had said to him, if you're going to appoint an investigator or whatever you're going to do, please don't do it till this election coming up is over, because they're accusing me of being political, and this is not political. And when I came back from South America, I found out, not by Governor Cuomo, but I was called by members of the State Investigation Commission telling me that they were investigating the Suffolk County criminal justice system. And that was the 5 worst years of my life. I mean, absolutely the 5 worst years. It lasted for 5 years. I was the lead witness in a television hearing because I was the one who brought the charges against him. And ultimately, after 5 years, a report was written which said that it was worse than I had even seen as a judge. And as a result of what I had done, the district attorney resigned, the county executive resigned, the entire homicide squad either resigned or retired. There was only one indictment, and it was the head of the police laboratory, who by that time was the head of the Baltimore State Troopers crime lab. And I became public enemy number 1. I'm telling you, I was public enemy number 1. This was a county that I had brought a black cloud over, and the police were very much involved in the Republican Party, and I was accused of being political, and this was totally non-political. Well, anyway, The end of my 10 years, in the 9.5 years of my term, I was up for reelection. And lawyers were coming to my chambers and they would say to me, Judge, a judge gets to know lawyers. I mean, you talk to them in conferences that become your friends sometimes. And these were a couple of Democratic lawyers, and they said, Judge, you're not going to get renominated. And by the way, my partner had now become the New York State Democratic chairman and was back in the county again. I said, no way. I practiced law with Dominic for 10 years. He's not going to renominate me? I said, this was not political, but I should be a hero to my party, not a villain. Well, comes a judicial convention, which is the way they nominate judges in New York State. The next morning I read in the newspaper that somebody else was nominated to my position. And I started calling Dominic, because when I started getting the rumors I would call him, he'd never answer the phone. But the next day he answered the phone, and I said to him, Dominic, how could you do this to me? And his answer to me was, Stuart, this was just not your year. So that's politics. In any event, people asked me to run for district attorney. Because there was going to be a district attorney's race the following year. And I went home and talked to my wife and my children, and they said to me, Daddy, if you stay here, they're going to kill you. And so I'm in North Carolina. 3 weeks after I got to North Carolina, and by the way, I've never practiced law in North Carolina. I really had intentions of doing that. I even went through a continuing law course, but I said I didn't have it in my stomach anymore to practice law after what I had been through. And 3 weeks after I came to North Carolina, I got a telephone call from New York, from the New York State Association of Criminal Defense Attorneys, and they're some of the top defense attorneys in the country. And they said, Judge, you have been nominated for the Justice Thurgood Marshall Award. Now, Justice Thurgood Marshall had only died 3 weeks before that. Then I get a call from the New York State Bar Association and said, I'm going to be given the David C. Michaels Award for what I had done. And then a call from the NAACP saying that we want to make you a lifetime member of the NAACP of Long Island. And they took us to New York, and I got all these awards. And people would ask me, well, what do you think of? The newspapers would write me or call me and ask me, well, isn't that great? What do you think of that? I said, yeah, it's wonderful, except that as far as I'm concerned, they took my robes away. I did what was right, and they took my robes away. And no, I was bitter for a long time, to be honest with you. 3 years later, my wife, who, by the way, never wanted to leave Suffolk County, she loved her job. She worked hard to be a probation officer. 3 years later, my wife, in my arms on a Sunday morning, had a heart attack and died. This was a perfectly perfectly healthy woman who had never been sick, really. And Nancy, who's there, my present wife now, Nancy was a water aerobics instructor, and she'll tell you that Lenore was the only person in her class to wear a two-piece bathing suit. But that's the way it was. I've always tried to analyze how could this happen, and I think what really happened was she did not want to leave Suffolk County, and she always carried that in her heart, and eventually that heart gave out. But I've been through a lot of things in my life, and I wonder why I have. I was very bitter at first, because my life has become better, even though I'm not a judge and not an attorney. We travel, Nancy and I travel a lot. We've done documentaries. And by the way, let me mention, I've given some out. I brought a bunch of our documentaries on the Korean War, which we did. It took us 2 years of our life. And we have a bunch of them with us. Anybody interested, it's 3.5-hour documentary, and it's all about the Korean War from the day that the 17th Infantry Regiment moved from Japan into Korea right up to Pork Chop Hill. And so we've done things like that. We travel. And so I started to say to you that I'm talking about misjustice or injustice. There are two injustices here. To me, the injustice is what they did in the criminal justice system. And I can't say that it happens all over, but I can tell you this. While this was going on in Suffolk County, Los Angeles County was having problems with their police. Judges in Chicago were being indicted for criminal activity and taking bribes. I am a great advocate for non-elected judges, appointment of judges through a merit system, the same system that I went through in New York in order to become a county court judge. Because I know the district attorney is here, and of course he can't talk about these things. But I know, as sure as I'm standing here, that the justice system the way it works now, this elected system of judges is no good. When the investigation started in Suffolk County, they asked me, Judge, with the investigation commission, would there be any other judge we could talk to who could tell us more about this system? And I said, well, you know, there's one guy who's a really good friend of mine. He was a Democrat. And I said, he's a decent guy, and he's one of the 3 judges handling homicides like him, like me. And I said to them, I'll go down and talk to him. Well, the next day I went down to talk to this judge, and I said to him, Harry, you know what's going on with me? He said, yeah, because it was all over the newspapers. This was front page in the newspapers. He said to me, yeah, I know what's going on, Stuart. I said, Harry, would you speak to these people? And you know what his answer was? His answer was, and this is a decent man and a good judge, his answer was, Stuart, I can't get involved. I have to run next year. Okay? So that's why I say to you, and this has become my crusade, it'll never change. There are places that don't elect their judges. There is the Missouri system where people are elected non-politically, and then they come up before the electorate without any opponent, and they have to decide whether to continue them as judges or not. I think the system of elected judges is horrible. I think that, and I know, and I don't care whether you're in North Carolina, or whether you're in New York, or California, or Illinois, that judges are influenced by politics. If you know that you have to go back to that political party to get reelected, or you're answerable to the leader of that political party, then that's going to be in your mind when something happens that you're not going to speak out about it. And I firmly believe that someday, the only time we're going to have a true system of justice in this country is to avoid that, taking judge out of politics and putting judges before the people, not the politicians. And so that's my story. I really appreciated being here. As I said, I spoke to the NAACP 10 years ago, and this has been a wonderful occasion. I'm going to tell you one short story, just one short story. It's probably now 14 or 15 years ago, Nancy and I went to New York to see a musical. We went to see the musical Bring in the Noise, Bring in the Funk with Savion Glover. Most of you must know who Savion Glover is. And we were sitting up in the top of the balcony. We had gotten discount tickets. And I looked down at Savion Glover and his dancing, and I said to Nancy, I said, you know, I could do that. Now, I had never danced in my life, never tap danced. And she said to me, okay, when we go home, we're going to buy you tap shoes. So we went home and I bought tap shoes. We cut out the carpeting in our movie room, which is in the lower half of our house because we live on the marsh, on a hill. And that became my tap dance floor, and the television set was my mirror. And I went to a lesson at the senior center, but everybody was older. There was one man who was older than me, and they were all women. And I didn't dance like they danced. And I said to Nancy, look, I can't dance like them. I'm not going back there again, but I know I can dance. And so I started teaching myself tap routines. And I entered in senior games. I had nothing else to do, so I entered in senior games. I have won 2 gold medals in one. Anyway, but let me tell you that this is really the tagline. I'm tap dancing in Raleigh one day, and I'm doing a routine that actually was out of Bring in the Noise, Bring in the Funk. I actually jumped over trash cans. And I got off stage, and there was 2 black ladies in the wings. And one of them looked over to me, and she said to me, man, where did you get that rhythm? And I looked over there, and I bent down, and I whispered in her ear, you know, I got some black blood in me. And she turned to her friend, she said, I told you so, I told you so. Thank you very much.